Greetings all, and welcome to the 5th learning unit, which gives an overview of all the different modes of transport. As previously mentioned, there are various modes of transport, those being road, railway, air, and pipeline transport. In this chapter, we will look to dive further into these modes of transport, distinguish between truckloads and less than truckload suppliers, key characteristics of the road industry, amongst other contents of the learning unit. So without further ado, let's get right into it. As seen in the previous slide, the road transport mode is the most dominant for freight transport in South Africa. Furthermore, Transnet's road-to-rail strategy aims to rebalance the road-rail freight split and reduce the numbers of heavy trucks on the road. Let us now look at the difference between truckload and less than truckload carriers. The services provided by truckload carriers include requirements of the shippers to meet the minimum truckload shipments, the rates, or a shipper that will pay the difference. In simple terms, truckload carrier picks up a truckload and delivers it as is to the said destination. Alternatively, a less than truckload carrier offers services to shippers who ship quantities below the minimum requirements of a truckload carrier, for example 50 to 10,000 kilograms. Now let's look at the operating and service characteristics of the motor carriers. It can be noted that the easy accessibility of a motor carrier makes it more advantageous than the other modes. Another advantage is that it can provide services at any location and is not limited to special needs like railway roads, water pipelines, etc. As such, the motor carrier is regarded as the universal coordinator because it is somewhat integrated in all the other modes. Now, what do we mean by that? Let us look at an example of air transportation. This usually works from airport to airport and would inevitably require the aid of motor carrier to deliver the shipments to and from the airport. Next, let's look at the cost structure of motors. In the motor carrier industry, most of its costs are as a result of variable costs and fixed costs, which are viewed to be relatively low. As per the international standards, approximately 70% is variable costs and only 30% is fixed cost. Most of the variable costs can be attributed to fuel, wages, maintenance, etc. Fixed costs are costs that remain constant irrespective of what is produced. Variable costs, on the other hand, vary with production. For example, fuel depends on the distance required to be traveled. We now dive into the second mode of transportation, that being railroad. As of recently, railroad has since evolved into a transport system that transports large quantities of goods and services, whereas in the past it was regarded as the most prominent and primary mode of transporting just above every good or raw material. Now, as we have seen to an extent and introduced the general service characteristics of railroad, let us investigate the strengths and constraints thereof. Perhaps the most obvious and most impacting constraint is that of the fixed routes, which they travel, which has an impact on service completion. As such, another mode of transportation is sometimes used to get goods from one point to another. Alternatively, railroads offer large capacity in terms of space and can move larger quantities of goods and services over long distances. This allows the railroad carriers to carry transport just about any commodity with little to no constraints as far as capacity and weight is concerned. Just like the motor carriers, the railroad also has its own cost structure. In the short run, which is a period where capacity and plant remain fixed, the railroad industry, in terms of cost, consists of a large portion of fixed costs than variable costs, as opposed to the motor carriers. The reason for this is because the railroad, much like the pipeline industry, are said to be the only modes of transport that own and maintain their own network and terminals. The third mode of transport is the airline transport, which depends on passenger revenue to maintain its financial viability. One of the agencies working with the Department of Transport, known as the Airports Commission of South Africa, was formed to own and operate the 9 South African airports, as well as the 3 main international gateways, which are the OR Tambo, Cape Town, and King Shaka international airports. There also exist different types of air carriers, namely for hire as well as private carriers. For hire carriers can be classified into major carriers, for example, national carriers or regional carriers. On the other hand, private carriers, which refer to a firm that transports company personnel and freight in planes that it owns or leases. Within airline transport, there exists competition in various aspects or ways. Considering the unique service offered by airline transport, it follows that there exists limited competition from other modes of transport in both passenger and freight movement. This is because of their ability to move passengers or freight over long distances of travel in a relatively short period of time. This refers to as intermodal competition. Ultimately, you ought to have competition within the airline industry, a phenomenon known as intramodal competition. One manner of competing in this industry is through lowering prices, which is usually done by a carrier with excess capacity to sell more seats. Incentivized with the freedom of entry and profits made in the industry, new entrants enter the market, creating more choices for passengers, resulting in price wars, which ultimately lowers the price charged to passengers. Now, in airline transport, there also exists service competition as well as cargo competition. Let us further elaborate on just what each of these mean and their application. An important factor related to airline service competition is the frequency and timing of flights on a route. Carriers need to always be able to meet the demand of customers at any point of demand. For example, mornings and afternoons, as well as before holidays like Easter holidays. As part of service competition, advertising and the differentiation between airlines is used. Alternatively, cargo competition has two aspects, those being speed and accessibility. In terms of speed, airline services have an advantage in terms of the speed at which it provides its services, while in terms of accessibility, it is relatively reliable, apart from when suffering from bad weather conditions. Next, under airline transport, we will look at the different types of equipment. Like motor carriers, airlines have different types of planes, ranging from small commuter planes to four-engine planes that are used by national carriers. Each type of plane has different operating costs and airports which are financed by the government. The infrastructure used by airlines is paid for by them through landing fees, taxes on fuel, rent, and leasing payment for space, etc. Now let us turn our attention to the cost structure of airline transportation. The operating costs under the mode of transportation consist of larger fixed cost than variable costs, like railroad transportation. The reason for higher fixed cost is due to the funding provided by the government to operate airports and airways. The variable costs again consist of fuel and labor, for example, pilots, flight engineers, and flight attendants, etc. The conclusion of airline transport brings us to the next mode of transport, which is water transport. Water transport is still an integral part for trade amongst countries and competes with rail and pipeline in terms of moving larger quantities of commodities. For example, the Nile River in Egypt is important in promoting trade and movement in that region. Internationally, water transport is considered the main means of transportation between countries to facilitate trade. This is done through shipment in large containers. Further to that, this mode of transport is considered a medium to long distance carrier, which means frequent stops along the journey are not a good idea. Water transportation, like airline transportation, has limited accessibility in that it requires other modes of transportation to move goods from and to the harbor, for example, road or rail transportation. The negative part associated with this mode of transport is that it is relatively slow in terms of speed. It can also be affected by heavy storms and rough seas. Lastly, in this mode of transport, there are two types of carriers, those being private carrier and regulated water carriers. Now let us look at the ocean transportation providers, which are liner, charter, or private services. Liner services are known to serve a particular area and may carry containers or break bulk shipments, while charter services are provided by ships hired for a specific period of time. Private services, as previously described, are no different from operating a private fleet of trucks. As mentioned, there are types of carriers, namely container ships and break bulk ships. While container ships are also known as box ships, are good for loading and unloading speed, and were primarily built for moving cargo under the deck of the ship. On the other hand, break bulk ships are capable of transporting shipments of unusual sizes in bags or crates, etc. The negative side of break bulk shipping is that it is time consuming and labor intensive, as it requires loading and unloading processes. You may be asking yourself, who competes with water carrier? Well, in truth, water carriers compete amongst themselves and with other modes of transport, namely rail and pipelines. Water carriers compete with rail for movement of dry bulk commodities such as grain, coal, and ores. Lastly, water carriers and pipelines compete for movement of bulk liquids such as petroleum products, and chemicals. There are various equipment associated with water transport, and since water carriers specialize in transporting bulk materials, they use ships with a large capacity, with the largest ship being the tanker, which can carry 18,000 to 500,000 tons of liquid, most often petroleum and or petroleum products. The terminals for water carriers are provided by the public sector. It follows that most of the ports are operated by government agencies. Now let us look at the cost structure of the water transport, which is said to be not labor intensive and consist of high variable cost and low fixed cost, which is similar to motor transport as covered earlier. Water transport, unlike road and air transport, do not have to provide their own rights of way. Carriers in this mode of transport also pay for fuel taxes, which forms part of user charges and ultimately variable costs, in order to utilize government-provided services. The fixed cost in the water mode of transport are depreciation and amortization, while operating rents and maintenance form part of variable costs. In South Africa, there are various different ports. These include the following: the Port of Richards Bay, the Port of Durban, the Port of East London, the Port of Port Elizabeth, the Port of Cape Town, the Port of Saldanha, the Port of Ngqura, the Port of Mossel Bay. Yep, that's right. This is the last mode of transportation, the pipeline mode of transportation, which is a unique industry in many ways. Pipelines have limits in the markets they operate in, such as the limited number of commodities they can transport. This mode of transportation is the only mode of transportation without a backhaul. As such, it moves only in one direction. The types of products handled by the pipeline transport are coal, gas, petroleum, and petroleum products. Let us now turn our attention to the disadvantages and advantages of pipeline transportation. The advantages are as follows. Pipelines also have what is referred to as loss and damage record, which results in low damages since products are underground and completely encased. This mode of transport is reliable in that it is unaffected by weather conditions and terrorism risk. The disadvantages are as follows. Pipeline transport include the fact that at times the slow speeds of pipelines can be considered a disadvantage. Pipelines are also unable to offer a complete service since they have fixed routes, which does not include door-to-door service like road transport. Pipelines are limited to selected products only. Pipelines can also be regarded as an inflexible mode of transport, serving only specific locations in which the pipelines are built. In the past numerous modes of transportation, we looked at the competition level, who would compete with that particular market structure. We should be asking ourselves the same question. In the pipeline industry, which in South Africa is largely dominated by Transnet, competition can be intramodal and intermodal in nature. The prior is limited in South Africa due to the small number of companies in existence, while intermodal competition exists from the pipeline industry in the form of a tanker. The last section of this learning unit speaks of the cost structure of this very mode of transport. Under pipeline transportation, there exists a high proportion of fixed costs, for example, terminal facilities of pipelines, and with low capital turnover. Pipeline owners must come up with their own right of way with the construction of the pipelines. In this mode of transport, there is a high level of automation, which means labor is not by any means incentive. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of the video. I hope with the content shared today of advantages and disadvantages, the cost structure, the competition amongst the modes of transport, we can now carefully analyze and choose the most effective and efficient mode of transportation based on the need for such demand. See you in the next video. Bye for now.